For those of you whom I've not met, I'm Steve Clemens. I run the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. We have a lot of cool things have gone on in this room, and it's always good to see Mark Bruzonsky with his camera there, because he's captured more of it than I think we have, but some very important talks here. And Richard Vague, as I wrote in the email that got sent out, is a person that I met when we were organizing a very, very large terrorism conference that we did in September of 2005, September 6th and 7th of 2005. We had 83 speakers, and they ranged from John Ashcroft to George Soros, if you want to look at diversity of views. Wes Clark spoke, Chuck Hagel. Excuse me, folks. And we were dealing with how one would reframe some of the aspects of terrorism, dealing with terrorism, and kind of, in our view, deconstructing what the global war on terror meant. But what Richard, when we met, brought to the table was looking at the economic dimensions of what was going on in the world that were being pushed off the radar screen, and helped us arrange a follow-on conference called Beyond Bullets, and looking at the economic dimensions of global insecurity and stability. And we had Hernando de Soto speak, Jay Winnick, my colleague here, Peter Bergen, Cy Hirsch, and it was a fascinating meeting. And in the process of doing this, I'd gotten to know Richard, and I don't think he will mind me sharing the fact that I know from looking at his political donations in the Federal Elections Commission website that he's given to both parties, but predominantly to Republican. And most people who know him look at Richard as a centrist conservative, if that makes sense, but a centrist conservative, a centrist Republican, who nonetheless has given money to Joe Biden. He's got a company in Delaware. You have to do those things. But he's a very successful businessman who was the founding co-founder and chief executive officer of First USA Bank. My Yahoo Visa was once housed within his empire, and he subsequently sold that firm and is now the CEO of Juniper Financial and Barclays. If you go by, as I do frequently on the Amtrak, Acela up to, when the Acela is working, up to New York, you go by Wilmington, Delaware. That big, giant red building is his current operation. And so we know each other, not only because he's a business person involved, but when I don't invite that many business people, whether they're supportive of our efforts or not, to speak. What I am interested in is the fact that he went through an arduous process that was his process. In Washington, we have no shortage here of smart people who have PhDs, who've done diligent work and thinking. Shelby, come set up here. I want to, this is a really cool day because it's a great crowd, but we have Shelby Coffey, who's an old friend, who was editor of the Los Angeles Times for many years, and you can have it. Front row.
I never come in late.
And Ann Crittenden is here, a prize-winning author as well. But Shelby, this is off topic, but Shelby essentially, without knowing it, when I was sort of a youngster in Los Angeles and wanting to change the world, I was running the Japan-America Society of Southern California at that time, and Times Mirror Corporation, was the biggest kid on the block. They helped in more ways than one launch my career. So I owe Shelby, who I went in, and I remember when I first ran the Japan-American Society, which had become an irrelevant and nearly bankrupt organization after being alive for 80 years. And I said, if we're not on the front page of the LA Times, we don't matter. And so that became our central focus, and Shelby helped a lot. So in any case, that's why
you did an amazing job. I can testify.
Well, it's an honor to have Shelby Coffey here today. In any case, Richard Vague is a businessman who went through a process, like many public intellectuals do, of submitting their work and ideas to other scrutiny, and had editors and had people here like Peter Bergen. We have a U.S. in the World project here, which we brought over from the Aspen Institute and Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And Richard subjected himself to a process of getting beaten up, encouraged, cornered, challenged, in a very long process of trying to put together how he approached this question as someone concerned about particularly the global economic state we're in, and wrote what I thought was a truly, and I use the words organic, it's from him, as opposed to being distilled by people who were part of the inside the Beltway Washington punditocracy. And I really support that. And I wanted to find a way to reach essentially the folks playing golf in Kansas who weren't going to listen to Steve Clemons or Peter Bergen, even on the best nights on CNN or something like that, and figure out how we do it. We helped support the distribution of Richard's thoughtful piece, Terrorism, A Brief for Americans. I encouraged him to go out and acquire a bunch of cartoons that help tell some of the stories, so the cartoons are in there to help that. And when you go to this online, it's at americaspurpose.org, you can really, the graphics online are even much, much better than what are here. We have had well over 1 million hits on his brief, and we've had getting all the numbers now, but well over 100,000 downloads. Now, downloads are important because it's even more genuine read of the interest of people of a larger document. If you're in, this is a wall here of some of the public policy books New America Foundation has published, all of them with commercial publishers. A bestseller in this business is 20 or 30,000. When you get over 100,000 downloads of something, and these are people in Rotary clubs and people around the country, you've got a mark of something. And I just realized that as good a job as I think that we do here, or do at Brookings, do at AEI, to a certain degree we also are talking to an audience that already wants to be involved in this discussion. Part of it is the question of how do you reach beyond that. And I really appreciate Richard Vague for investing the time and putting himself up for such scrutiny on this issue of trying to get out. But it's already been successful, and I wanted to give some of us an opportunity to have a conversation with Richard about what drove him to do this, what his thinking is, how he sees the world, because I think it's important for us to not just listen to ourselves in this. So please welcome my good friend Richard Vague, who's the author of Terrorism, A Brief for Americans. Richard Vague.
Merci beaucoup. It's a great privilege to be here, and I have greatly appreciated the leadership and assistance that I've gotten from Steve and so many others as I have wrestled with what to me is perhaps the greatest issue of my political lifetime. I have historically been a conservative, but as I look at history, there is nothing intrinsically Republican about war. And in fact, if you look at it, more of America's involvement in wars have come through Democratic leadership. So the very idea that because you're a Republican, you should also be for our war in Iraq didn't strike me as rational and still does not. When the war began, the price of oil was $28 a barrel. It's now $63, $64 a barrel. Interest rates were 450 basis points lower then than they are now. Our deficit, our cumulative deficit as a country, was so close to zero that there was discussion about retiring entire classes of bonds. The 30-year bond itself was in peril of being retired as a class of bonds, the 10-year bond, and others. So the war has had a more structural effect on the economy than I think has yet been given credit. And in fact, the most difficult part of my business career was the years after Vietnam, where the accumulated deficit of that period was a drain on the economy for many, many years. So all that having been said, there are economic reasons to be concerned about that, but there are much bigger reasons, social, moral, and others, to be looking at this issue. So with a lot of folks' help, we have looked deeply into the issue, and our belief is that more, much more, can be accomplished to reduce terrorism, if that's indeed your objective, by building things up rather than tearing them down. And building things up in places like Morocco, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Turkey, and elsewhere. Especially if this building up is accompanied by a resolution, whatever that resolution is, in Palestine. and Palestine is much more central to the issues of global terrorism than is ordinarily given credit. What we instead are doing and continue to do has the effect of increasing terrorism, and that's where we are today. Now, terrorism and terrorists have existed throughout history in all countries. You know, you get the idea when I talk to kind of everyday folks that it's an Islamic phenomenon, but in fact, it has existed in all historical eras, in essentially all countries, in essentially all religions. And in fact, there have been more occurrences in the period since World War II. There have been more occurrences of terrorism in stable democracies than in any other country. If you look at things like white supremacist acts in the United States, the Red Brigade in Germany, the Red Army faction coming out of World War II in Japan, and the list goes on and on and on. There's a great documentation of this that's been prepared by Eubank and Weinberg that's instructive to read. So terrorism exists more in stable democracies than it does elsewhere. But the influence of those terrorists, be they white supremacists or others, is usually marginalized. It's usually very limited. A terrorist act that occurs somewhere in the United States that's a white supremacist act usually stays very contained and does not get the support of the broad population. So the key question becomes, what is it in these Middle Eastern countries that causes the broader population to respond and support terrorists? And the answer is, as you look at all the instances of terrorism, whether it's over the last 50 years or if you extend back centuries and include Russia in the early 20th century and the Bolshevik Revolution, Napoleon in Spain in the early 1800s, and dozens of other examples, the answer is there are two things that cause a broad population to empathize with and in some cases go so far as to support terrorists: occupation and oppression. A great example of occupation is the occupation of Ireland by England in the 17 and 1800s, which manifested itself so clearly with the IRA and others, splinter groups from that in the 1900s. A great example of oppression is Peru in the 1960s and 70s, where you had, in essence, a dictatorship, a military dictatorship in that situation. And you had the telltale signs, by the way, of this oppression, corruption, a concentration of wealth in a very few hands. But the commonality between oppression and occupation is, in both cases, the people are deprived of a participation in government. And the basic obligations of government to the governed are not fulfilled. The most central of these always ends up being the enforcement of property rights, but is closely followed by things like safety, education, access to opportunity, and the like. And in the post-industrial age, when the broad population is not allowed to participate in government, does not have enforcement of property rights, the inevitable results are poverty and despair, which are in fact the things that make a population receptive to alternative choices. We shouldn't have wondered, we shouldn't have been surprised when we noted that Hezbollah was building hospitals for the population there. We shouldn't have been surprised when we learned that the Taliban was operating schools in Afghanistan. There was a void, there was a vacuum. And where a vacuum exists, an alternative arises to provide the things that people genuinely need to live their lives. Further examples of occupation include the French in Vietnam in the early part of the 1900s through the 1950s. We already mentioned Napoleon in Spain in the early 19th century, which is where, by the way, the term guerrillas actually comes from. It was the Spanish word for a terrorist. Much that's going on in Latin America, especially during the 19th century. France and Algeria during the 1800s and early 1900s. Oppression examples we've already cited are Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century. Many countries today in the Middle East and Africa fulfill this autocrat, dictator, oppression definition. Now, the issue continues to be a very major issue globally and may be a bigger issue today than it was 50 years ago because there is still so much oppression and occupation throughout the world. The issue has Muslim dimension because of the relative economic status of predominantly Muslim countries. As you dig into it, the statistics are a little startling. In the world today, of the 6.7 billion people in the world today, 1.3 billion of them are Muslim. 45 of the world's 193 countries are predominantly Muslim. And so that alone makes a difference. If there are terrorists in Ireland, if there are terrorists in Northern Ireland, well, the population of Northern Ireland is less than 1 million. If you have terrorists associated with poverty in Muslim countries, it's more visible. I would note, though, that of the 45 countries that are predominantly Muslim, 41 of those 45 are former colonies or subsumed Soviet states. And being a colony, being a former Soviet state, in essence slows or retards the organic development of leadership within the country. So we shouldn't be surprised at the tenuous state of leadership and the propensity toward autocracies in these countries. And of these 45, 37, by our imperfect count, are still not bona fide democracies. There's a table, there's a chart in one of Niall Ferguson's books. Niall Ferguson does a great job, especially when it comes to kind of going out and ferreting out from primary sources economic data. But he has a chart where it takes the regions of the world and puts them on kind of a democracy index, and the Middle East just pops out because it is so far further down the scale than any other region in the world. Now, I'd make what I would consider to be a crucial additional observation. Because Islamic fundamentalism is so intertwined with what we see in the discussion that occurs, I think it's critical to note that fundamentalism, whether that fundamentalism is Islamic fundamentalism, or whether it's in Judaism, or whether it's Christian fundamentalism, fundamentalism tends to be, throughout history, a reaction to stress and or rapid change in a society. Karen Armstrong has written a book called The Battle for God that is a documentation, if you will, of 500 years' worth of this reality, where you have great stress. And stress can be caused by positive change as well. I mean, I would argue that no society has had as much positive change as the United States has. No country has seen as rapid a change in almost every element of our lives as the United States today. That creates stress. And that has led to this same fundamentalist reaction in our country. but particularly when there is stress created by war or pogroms or other types of oppression, the inevitable reaction is extremes in the case of fundamentalism. And really, as you reflect on it, it's the replacement of uncertainty. It is the introduction of certainty into a context where there is great uncertainty. We were in Morocco. My delightful sister Joanna is here with me today, and she and I and others were in Morocco a couple of years ago, and we were taking a tour through one of the mosques. And we were next to a delightful Muslim mother there who was in full abaya, and her what looked like 10-year-old or so daughter was standing next to her in her capri pants with her Madonna t-shirt on. The pace of change in these countries. I mean, the presence of fundamentalism, rather than being evidence of a backslide in these countries, is instead evidence of the fact that they are so rapidly moving forward. So, the best way to address terrorism is by addressing the situations of oppression or occupation. In Peru, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was, as you all know, the Shining Path terrorist group who was regularly blowing up buildings and killing people and initiating military attacks. The Shining Path essentially isn't around today. And one of the biggest parts of the equation in solving the issue was the property rights reform that occurred in Peru. And we had the great pleasure of working with Hernando de Soto, who was one of the real thought leaders in this. I mean, he was sitting there saying, you know, most of the people in this country are poor. Most of them have no ability to own assets. Most of them don't have property right protection. So if some third-party group's coming in and saying, you're oppressed, you don't have ownership of land, and they're throwing a few bombs around, well, maybe they're right. And maybe the solution is to create economic opportunity for those individuals. And in fact, in Peru, it made an enormous difference. And the distribution, by the way, of land, which is so well documented in the works of De Soto and others, really was the equivalent, the distribution of land to individuals who were squatting on that land, shanty towns and the like, was in effect the equivalent of what happened over a period of 100 or 150 years in the United States in the form of our Homestead Acts. It wasn't charitable distribution. It was people who were already living on the land, had already built up businesses or homes or made improvements, and it was entitling them to those improvements. It wasn't charity, it was empowerment. And it was one of the things that drove the creation of a middle class in the United States over the course of a century or more. It was liberating folks to own what they already had, and furthermore, as De Soto points out, to leverage that. He says, in essence, there are $9.3 trillion around the world in these shanty towns that is leverageable for creation of new wealth if it can be legally titled in those individuals' names. Now, this all occurred in conjunction with the nascent movement forward of Peru's democracy. So whether it's in case of oppression or occupation, these things must be replaced by distributed power, by what we would call democracy. And of course, this is what the Bush administration has said. They've said, you know, we need democracy. Democracy is the solution. We agree with that. However, democracy cannot move forward. The distribution or decentralization of power cannot move forward unless it is accompanied by the simultaneous and equally vigorous distribution of economic opportunity. If power is pushed to the edges, The edges cannot afford to retain that power unless they have the money to do it. It just re-centralizes. And by the way, democracy, as it has so successfully worked in the United States, is not just people voting. The ingredients of our success are democracy, certainly, but it is the explicit limitation of powers. This is where the Bill of Rights starts to matter. It is the explicit separation of powers. It's a good thing that one branch of government can't declare war. The founders didn't trust anybody. They didn't want people to be able to act unilaterally. They wanted restrictions in red tape on the ability of government to act. They thought that was a good thing. Thus, the most central question in terrorism isn't how to stop terrorists. It is instead how in these countries to distribute power successfully and distribute economic opportunity successfully across the broad population. Now, in Iraq, one additional minor aside about terrorist groups. One of the things that's important to note when you look at terrorist group, whether it's Hezbollah or whether it's the Egyptian Brotherhood or what have you, what routinely happens in these cases is that there's oppression or occupation and a terrorist group is formed, the IRA in Ireland. At some point in the conflict between that terrorist group and the power in charge, that terrorist group wants to start negotiating or working towards a solution with that power. What happens at that point in time is a splinter group is formed. Some subset of those terrorists say, we don't negotiate with the government. And so you had things like the real IRA, which was a separate terrorist group from the IRA formed. Or INLA. I think last count there was like 5 or 6 separate, what I would call a splinter terrorist groups that are formed. And every time a splinter group is formed, it is, you can look at this pattern again and again and again. It is smaller than the original terrorist group, and it is more extreme. And its pronouncements are more extreme, and we should expect that. And so it's difficult for me to sit there on a Sunday morning and watch highly educated folks on a highly regarded Sunday morning talking show talk about how we should be worried that all Muslims want the caliphate reestablished in Spain. And that happened. I'm not fabricating that. Well, that's not what all Muslims want. That's what a splinter group of a splinter group of a splinter group is articulating. What people want is what all of us want. What people want is to be able to hang out with their kids, to love, to succeed, to matter, to have respect. That's what people want. Now in Iraq, we have something that I almost think of as a little bit off topic. But Iraq, I would argue that the issue is simple, and the solution conceptually is simple, although that solution is extremely difficult to execute. We've inadvertently taken sides in a civil war. That's what we did. That's where we are. We inadvertently took sides in a civil war. And I would bet you that the majority of people that are involved in that today don't know that or feel that way about it. In 1919, there were 3 provinces of the vast and multi-centuried Ottoman Empire that happened to be adjacent to each other: Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Some mid-level, may I use the term bureaucrat?
Only fondly.
In the British government recommended, well, I'm not going to, recommended that they come together in a single country. And the diversity that we see today that is creating the conflict between Sunni, Shiite, and Kurd was already present. And there were already enough problems by 1920 and then the years after that that Britain was already having to bomb, not having to, resorting to bombing villages in Iraq to overcome that. Fast forward, and what we're emerging from is 30 years, maybe it's longer than that, but at least 30 years of fairly overt oppression of Shiites by Sunnis. And when we say oppression, we mean jailing people, we mean murdering people, we mean assault, we mean systematic exclusion from economic opportunity. Any of us could go examine the data and find that all those things were the case. Now, if we didn't know anything else, and that 30-year period had come to an end, and all the rifles had been taken out of the hands of the Sunnis, and we knew that they were the minority of the country, and we didn't know anything else, what would we expect? I think what we would expect is the 60+% of the country that had been oppressed for the last 30 years would have their day. That corresponds to everything we know about human nature. So now we have the Shiite response. Now we're in a civil war, and there's another study that I would refer you to if you haven't read it already by a gentleman named Chaim Kaufman, who's done a comprehensive analysis of ethnic civil wars since World War II. Now this civil war is only partially ethnic, and Kaufman rank orders civil wars by ethnic and closely behind that religious, and then a myriad reasons underneath that happen to have to do with one military faction going against another or what have you. But for ethnic civil wars, he has documented that they only end one of three ways, or they only conclude one of three ways. One of it is that one side wins completely. The vast majority of the time, one side prevails. The second way is that there's a partition. You know, what I guess more recently has been called a soft partition, where some third party comes in and serves to separate the combatants into neutral corners, not to use a trivial metaphor, but you know, whether it's Azerbaijan, Armenia, whether it's Kosovo and the Dayton Accords, folks come in and mediate by physically separating folks. And the third thing that happens in civil war is they fester, they get submerged and remain, the conflict remains. For us to think in the face of that evidence that these folks can learn to get along together kind of mid-Civil War, kind of on the fly, has no corresponding event out there in the real world. That's why I believe that the idea that's been put forward fairly articulately by Leslie Gelb and Joe Biden and a number of other folks, you know, is the better idea in this case. Now, folks, especially these days and kind of the early days of a presidential campaign, talk about if we leave, it'll be horrible. And yet, and I think there's, you know, all sorts of complexity to this idea, but I would at least introduce the minor idea that those lines look identical to the lines that existed in 1961 and 62 in Algeria, where the Parisian headlines screamed, "If we leave, chaos will ensue," or United States newspapers in the late 60s and early 70s as it relates to our intervention in Vietnam. Going forward, you know, it seems to us that the very fact that so much hope was pinned to the surge strategy really underscores that people are thinking of Iraq as a military problem, and it is not. You know, we believe that the whole issue must be approached holistically. There are 45 nations that are predominantly Muslim. We believe if you had $1 trillion, you know, some folks estimate this war is going to cost $1 trillion, some folks $2 trillion. If you had $1 trillion, and if it were 2002, and somebody said, reduce terrorism, make things better in the Middle East? We would argue that the better deployment of that capital, or some subpart of that capital, would have been to make things better, move countries like Turkey or Morocco or Indonesia or others forward on these two central issues of decentralization of power and decentralization of economic opportunity. Every success in one of these countries positively influences the other 44 and serves as an example to the other 44. We must build up rather than tear down. Our most powerful weapon is the example we can set, coupled with fundamental decency and fairness. Those are my comments. There's more we could talk about, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Let me, you stand here. Let me grab this. Let me open. The reason you initially started writing this, I know, was because you were golfing with one of your buddies. I think you were talking about Israel-Palestine issues. And you, if I remember correctly, were disturbed about your friend's lack of awareness on these issues. So I have two questions. One, has he read this and what does he think? And two, your bottom line message, as I know, really is one about economic issues. I tried to get at that. I was very, very much opposed to, despite what Richard Pearl said on his TV show the other night, I worked very hard in a responsible way to oppose the invasion of Iraq for a lot of other reasons. One, looking at things like occupation of Japan, which I knew something about. But once we did invade, I wrote a piece in the New York Times that basically said how to get an occupation right. And one of them was to very quickly create a class of political and economic winners, who are winners because of your presence there, who can become important. We did that in Japan, not as George Bush talked about through a constitution or maintaining the emperor or providing women's rights, all fine. What we really did is with land reform. We broke up big aristocratic estates and we distributed Japan quite broadly throughout Japan. It became a problem 40 years later with rice trade, but that was a fundamental winner for us. And in the Iraq case, oil was the land equivalent. And so I had suggested the Alaska Permanent Fund as a model that ought to be looked at as a way to distribute resources in a much more diverse way in the audience. The economic side of this is very important. And I assume that many other CEOs that are your pals are of that same ilk. So my second question is why do you think if corporate America could fall into the groove you said that it's been so ineffective in influencing this administration to think along those terms?
Well, the first question was, did my friend read and change his mind? And this it was a true story, and it was a dear friend who happens to be one of those individuals that has superb judgment, runs an extremely successful business, beloved, great father, all these other things. And this is in the invasion of Iraq, and I think it was one of those shock and awe type things, and he kind of cavalierly mentioned, and he's not a cavalier individual, don't you think now that we've bombed them, they'll leave us alone? And I looked at him and I said, Jeff, if somebody attacked you, would that make you leave them alone? Well, any honest answer by almost anybody was, hell no, it wouldn't. I would seek to get back. And I said, why is it that their human nature should be different than ours? And I think again and again you got to kind of return to what real human nature is like. And he thought about that, and he's a smart guy, and we had a little bit of a dialogue, and he did read this document. And in fact, he helped me with it. And yeah, those guys feel very different than that. Now, the question about businesses participating in government to kind of help some of these things happen in terms of economic deployment, was that your question?
Well, I'm just thinking in the days of Roosevelt, although Roosevelt is essentially nationalized a lot of American industry at the time to succeed in World War II, there is a dimension to this which is sort of, you can call it DeSotoism, but it's also just kind of thinking through what stabilizes a society. One of our projects here was building a global middle class. That if you want to build a global middle class, ought to be maybe the mantra that we look at in terms of looking at how to benchmark IMF and World Bank programs or ODA grants, and does it move a middle class oriented development forward in developing countries or not? I mean, that's something that I think is interesting, because what's attached to that? Schools, education, parents worried about their kids' futures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, make a play for modernity. And I meet business people all the time who are very consistent with your views. I just find it interesting that given the classic conservative role you've played, that spirit of thinking about global development is absent, in my view, in terms of our thinking about many of these issues. Some other people in the room may disagree, but I'm interested in why do you feel when you run in these business circles that other people largely share your general orientation? That's part one. Part two is, why do you think you're so politically impotent in a period of time when your party is in control?
Well, I think that I'm politically impotent because I'm politically impotent, by the way. It's very simple. But I think 9/11 represented a line of demarcation on this issue. Because I think, most folks kind of go through having, in their daily lives or their business lives, having to deal with so much is on their to-do list every day, that things that kind of aren't issues, you don't have time or even necessarily the interest to go focus on. So I think there was just it ain't broke, don't fix it. The rest of the world, when we get around to expanding to that country, we'll worry about that then. And I think, the increased globalization of countries and combined with 9/11 is making people think a lot more about these issues than they ever did before. But in the 4 or 5 years right after 9/11, I don't think there was a lot of room for people to express any strategy other than one of, hoping that Bush was right and, being on that bandwagon.
Interesting. Let me open the floor. Yes, right here.
Hi. Marty Merriman from the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict.
Cool.
Thank you for your comments, and I really appreciate and agree with your framework that occupation and oppression are two of the primary causes. For terrorism, I wanted to point out, interestingly, that if terrorism is the sort of espoused means of overcoming these things, that there indeed is an alternative that I think has been overlooked frequently, and that is nonviolent conflict or nonviolent action. Basically, people using strikes, boycotts, and forms of civic disruption to try to gain leverage in their situations. Not necessarily from a pacifist perspective, but very much from a perspective of trying to create some sort of political contention. And so if you look, for example, occupations in East Timor, Poland in the 80s, Lebanon in 2005, and even actually major elements of the American Revolution were based in basically people choosing to disobey and getting leverage that way. Similarly, oppression has been lifted in Chile under Pinochet, the Philippines under Marcos, Serbia in 2000, Ukraine 2004, Georgia 2003, Indonesia 98. It goes on through various forms of civic disruption. Therefore, I think one of the sort of tasks for the United States and other NGOs is to support groups who are trying to do this as an alternative means to terrorism. If I can just make one other point, I think a new discourse needs to be developed where basically if occupation creates a market for terrorism, you need to meet that demand with a new product, with something that's better. And I think if you can promise that some form of struggle will in fact yield better results, because the result of terrorism is pretty poor at yielding a society that people want to live in, nonviolent struggle could be part of presenting that form of struggle that might meet that demand better.
That's interesting. You could respond, or we can move on. More of a statement. It's interesting. Don't know if you have an office in Waziristan, but train some of the violent types to go nonviolent. It might be interesting.
And by the way, that brings to mind, Jay Winnick, who was one of our speakers a couple of years ago, has written some great books. The one I enjoyed particularly was about the conclusion of the Civil War. It's called April 1863. And he has this marvelous passage where he defines terrorism, in essence. And he says, terrorism, very succinctly, he says, terrorism is the way the weak make war against the strong. Right. Period. I mean, you want to fight somebody, they've got 100 times more money than you have, and they have weapons and you don't, and you want to fight them. That's the only way you can do it, is to throw bombs and do these other things. And early on in our dialogue, I would include that sentence in things that I gave people to read. And every time I did, the reader, including Jeff, by the way, were horrified that it was such a dispassionate. I said, how can you even put that sentence in there? Because, even if that's true, how does it excuse the horrors of, killing children and all these? Well, that's totally right. I mean, terrorism is a horrible, horrible thing.
Yes, sir. Alistair.
Hi, I'm Alistair Miller, and I direct the Center on Global Counterterrorism Corporation, and we work to try and strengthen multilateral approaches to counterterrorism, focused on non-military counterterrorism. We do a lot of work with major donor states outside the U.S., in Northern Europe and Japan and other places, who are very interested in this point that you outlined of a holistic approach to this problem. And what they're doing is they're not only encouraging the UN and multilateral institutions to take this holistic approach, but they're also focusing on how their own government can take a more holistic approach. So they're looking at integrating the development policies with their foreign policy, trying to defang some of what they're doing on the military side to ensure that they don't sort of have too much of a jackboot footprint on what they're doing. And what I'm trying to get from you here is, I think what your talk has presented is an excellent concept, but sitting here in Washington, I wonder how you can be policy prescriptive in suggesting how the U.S. government might take this holistic approach. In making private-public partnerships, but also as a government on their own, they have to do something, and I'd like to hear what it would be.
It was a very, very difficult, because I can remember, the most amazing thing about the Iraq War is how much money is being effortlessly expended. I mean, how many debates do I remember where, whether we gave this country $1 billion or $2 billion was debated for years. We're spending $1 billion or $2 billion every couple of days in Iraq. And it has changed my own personal thinking about the amount of money that is spent on the war. But I would be extremely pessimistic about, once the war ends, anybody being in the mood to spend $100 billion a year or $200 billion a year or whatever more than is currently being spent on something like that.
But part, if I may just editorialize, part of the challenge in getting this right, I'm familiar particularly with what the UK is doing, somewhat of what Germany's doing in line with your program. Part of the challenge is to go back and look at other times in American history where the assembled organs of government reorganize themselves, change decision-making to create a way and process. It's partly a management issue. Part of the failed solution of objectives, whether you want to be critical or not critical. Steve Hadley said in a rather candid moment, it was in an off-the-record setting, but since I got all of it leaked to me and doubly confirmed, I'm about to put it on my blog, so I will quote what Steve Hadley said. But Steve Hadley gave a long list of how his world differed so dramatically from Brent Scowcroft's when Brent was in the same position, and looking at the kinds of crises, looking at the number of issues they dealt with, dealing with the complexity of the world. Well, part of that is a management problem, and it's very interesting to go back at one of the last major changes, Goldwater-Nichols Act, that tried to rearrange decision-making. And I've been interested in the Goldwater-Nichols Act and how it tried to synthesize various parts of military decision-making, and we need a kind of one of those for the broader government. Now, let's just I'll play military-industrial complex guy here for a moment, say, if you could assemble and throw on the wall a set of objectives you want to throw your resources at over time using different apparatus of government, you wouldn't do what we're doing today. You wouldn't over-centralize so much money and spending and effort in one branch of that, which of course is the Department of Defense. Dana Priest here at this podium gave a talk on her book called The Mission. It was a fantastic book. I don't know if that won the Pulitzer. She's winning so many Pulitzers that it's hard to keep track. But we had a big argument here, a friendly one, because she made the case that the ambassadors, the ODA grants, the folks that are moving global affairs are our military attaches around the world. And she basically said there's no chance for any other parts of government to matter, so we might as well live with it and move in that direction. And I said that's exactly what we can't have happen, that we had to move in a different formulation. And the best project that I know of is one that's still embryonic, but Jim Locker, who was one of the great writers about Goldwater-Nichols, is trying to do that at the Institute for Defense Analyses, trying to bring in part of the DoD and launch an alternative project that would look at exactly this question, which is really how do you beef up other parts of the Frank Fukuyama wrote a book about this essentially, basically part of his Luther-like challenge to the neoconservative church of which he's a member. I actually think he's still a closet neoconservative who just is setting up a new church. But Frank's on my board, so I can get around saying that. I think my quote will be in The Economist this week. But I do think that there are a number of interesting initiatives that we just shouldn't throw up our hands and say, oh, there's just no chance for the future in dealing with a complex world and reality. There are people thinking very methodically about how to change dramatically the way in which Douglas Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, and other people were allowed to hijack the machinery of government because of the absence of structural strength more broadly that dealt with development, that dealt with the more holistic approach. So sorry to editorialize so much. Yes, sir. I'm sure there are other tokens. No. Yes, no, go ahead, please.
You mentioned about class, dominant class, not letting the lower classes get in, or lower minorities get in.
Why don't I give this to you?
Okay. The United States is a status quo power, has been since 1945. It has resisted change right around the world. If you're called a commie, whether it was the Iranians or Persians at the time, or the South Africans, or my crowd. And now that's been morphed into terrorism, which is basically Islamophobia. And that in its turn has spun off this massive value subtracting exercise called national security. And whereas patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel, national security is the first and only refuge of the scoundrel. And you've therefore got a class here, just like the Peruvian upper class, which I know something about, or the Mexican upper class, that resists change because there's stupidity. They want. You also have there's no question where the stupidest white men in the world are, and that's been the Beltway. And they're personified by that fraud down the street called Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz, sorry. I used to work for the World Bank, so I get confused with this Wolf is. Oh, by the way, you talk about those who are not included. I came from what might be called an aristocratic class. And as you can tell by my accent, I was sent to an institution in England where, never mind, the fees are now £10,000 a term. But anyway, I came back to Kenya very angry. And I wanted to blow up the Gymkhana club in Nairobi. I wanted to blow up the bull clubs and things. And I could have done it because I was a platoon commander of my cadet corps, and we knew how to make bombs. We were fighting the communists.
We're glad you did.
Yes.
I am not convinced with this definition of terrorism as the way that the weak make war on the strong. Gandhi won out without hurting innocent people. I think to deliberately target large numbers of people through death, especially women and children, old people, you have to have a fairly strong streak of sociopath.
Couldn't agree more. It's a horrible thing.
That's not the only way.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue it's the only way. Winnick was just saying it comes about because some weak folks are looking around for a way to combat, and it's the way there.
I can't talk about this specific case, but I'm involved with a battle with a public intellectual I know who may or may not have affiliation with us in the future, but who's writing a piece about terrorism and how to see it. But he's essentially writing it from the position of the aggrieved, and the aggrieved and sort of looking at it. And rather than speaking of the voice of the aggrieved, it's sort of I suppose, a normative comment that looks at this in ways in which looks at the tactic, but veers close to the edge of endorsing the tactic, endorsing and that's something that, I'm playing in the Shelby coffee role, tough decisions. I can't have that, connected to what I'm about. But it is interesting as this person goes out and lays out the argument of how you look at the tools and tactics that those who are rebellious or revolting or coming in deal with power. It's an interesting journey to look at some of these challenges in the eyes of the others on the other side. I tend to, as many people know, used to be director of the Nixon Center. I'm more of a realist. I am one who believes in power, and I don't think that the guy revolting against power automatically is right. I have very different views on this than a couple of folks in the room. I think that but I am a believer in economic opportunity. It's one of the things Grant Aldonis, who was the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Affairs at the Department of Commerce, who I respect greatly, spoke here. And, he made a comment. He said, we've moved economically to a winner-takes-all world. We don't have just a winner-takes-all society here in America. We have a winner-takes-all model globally. And that stratification is, you get less stakeholding in the opportunity game. And you can see this a lot. And that reality, then, he says, if you really cared about global development, just come back to the bank, IMF, et cetera, but also look at Doha, whatever. If you wanted to basically develop the world, there's a whole different list of things we would be negotiating for. And so if you want to really develop the world and turn into a stakeholder economic world, there are very different arrangements of that. And that's where I would like to see things go. But let me ask, yes, sir, and I'll go to Diane.
Yes. A question about your prescription package, basically the decentralization of property rights. I want to ask you for policy prescription way outside development. If you were invited to Ankara and you had a half an hour to speak with the Turks, and you said, this is my policy prescription package, and they would say to you, well, actually, we have democracy here, we have property rights, and decentralization would be a major mistake not only within our country, but decentralization in Iraq as well. Anything that goes closer to an independent de facto Kurdistan would be terrible for us. How would you respond to that?
We were actually in Istanbul, less than a year ago, and had some discussion with some folks about that, and were amazed at how quickly they said exactly what you said. The looks of disdain and the looks of what have. I tell you what. May I make one other statement before I answer your question? By the way, I have enormous faith in the United States. I think it is, in fact, the greatest country, and our ability to absorb new realities and learn them and begin to deploying them is amazing. And so I am an optimist, and I'm an optimist about this situation. I can't be in a small town in Texas or in New York City or anywhere in between where I'm not surrounded by folks that have enormous common sense and enormous awareness of human nature. So I'd say that. On your issue, the one thing that I didn't comment on in my remarks is the issue of ethnic divide. And I tell you, I think it is in fact as central and troubling an issue as there is in the world. And you just look at it this way. In the late 1800s, I think there were 60-something countries in the world. And today there's 192 or 3, depending on how you count it. And the difference between 60-something and 190-something is mainly, not exclusively, but predominantly, ethnic groups' inability to coexist. And, Tony Jute in his book, Post-War, which I'd recommend to anyone, very thoughtful and detailed work on kind of what's happened, makes the observation that kind of the history of Europe in the 1900s is a history of separating ethnic groups from each other. And that was a profound result of World War I and an equally profound result of World War II. And I think most of us would argue one that would make us grieve the fact. All I can say is that if you, because it's a horrible thing. It's a fundamentally horrible thing. It is also true, I would argue, that the world's country that has been the most successful in overcoming that is the United States. There is more ethnic diversity. There are more folks that are able to get along, Arab and WASP, Hispanic, and you name it, than anywhere in the world. But the only thing that I can offer, and it's not much, is that wherever there is economic despair, the ethnic hatreds that arise are much, much, much more pronounced than when it is a benign or prosperous economic environment.
And there are no quick fixes. Diane, quickly.
First of all, thank you for your work. I think it's brilliant and also very well conceptualized and organized and presented. And I think it's what you're saying is sort of self-evident, but nobody thinks about it. And also parallels what I've written on psychology of terrorism, also systems dynamics. And in response to a few other comments, I just want to say that all the psychological studies on terrorism is that they're psychologically normal. They might not be highly evolved and individuated, but they're not abnormal or diagnosable as psychotic or sociopath. And there's also an element of envy and humiliation, which we also saw in Virginia Tech, which has not been given enough proper understanding. And also there's needs theory. People would prefer to get their needs met by decent means, and when they're blocked and rejected and rebuffed and humiliated over and over again, then it drives people towards that and more fundamentalism, which is consistent with what you're saying, if I understand. And also I think we're doing it again with Iran, which Steve has done some very important work on. And I sort of have a term that there's what I think is political malpractice. And if you're practicing in any profession in law, medicine, psychotherapy, as I am, you have to, every intervention you make has to be based on bodies of knowledge, research, standards of practice. You can't prescribe a medication that's killed 85% of the patients. And we're doing this again with sanctions. And I started reviewing some of the literature on sanctions because they usually have, in about 85% of cases, they often have the opposite effect. And I was at a hearing yesterday on Capitol Hill, and Representative Ron Paul said all these things that sanctions drive people towards the more oppressive regimes and away from the one who imposes them, and they have the opposite effect, and he went on. And then everyone else presented how great sanctions were and how we have to punish them. And then he went back and he said, excuse me, did you not hear me, or did you disagree with me, or you think it's worth the cost? Everyone just completely disregarded what's based on sound bodies of knowledge into often to their own sort of punitive. And I think a lot of our policies are driven by emotion, fear, and desire to punish, dominate, and control. And we ignore whole bodies.
As opposed to incentive.
Right, or like what works, or healing.
I can't think anything I've ever done, from a business deal to dealing with one of my children to dealing with one of my pets to, that a positive incentive didn't get me where I wanted to go quicker than a negative one.
If I can just quickly add, and then we'll work around the room. When we had Hernando de Soto, I don't know how people have heard of Hernando. It's fairly a religious experience. I mean, it's fascinating because the guy is such a good salesman for what he's doing. I've looked into what he was doing in Nigeria and other places. It's fascinating. The right guy to pose the question you asked is to de Soto, who would know, I think, in great detail how to respond or why it wouldn't work. Because I think that there are downsides that one size fits all need to be avoided. But I will tell you that after I have remarkably maintained reasonable relations with the Bush administration every once in a while, trying to find a good soul who's done the right things and trying to do it. And so I've invited to roundtables and talks, State Department, CIA, DOD activities, and talk about this fundamental issue, which is why I like what Richard is trying to do from his own business perspective, approaching some of these issues so much, which is to look at whether our job in the world is to kill terrorists and kill bad guys, or whether it's to steal the audience. Because when you look at terrorism, and this is something I feel strongly, Osama bin Laden, I came out of Hollywood. I mean, Shelby Coffey and I were in Hollywood. And you see producers, executive producers, you've got the actors and performers, and of course you need people to buy the tickets. And the question is, a lot of people are buying the tickets for what certain antagonists out there are provoking with terrorism to try and look legitimate in the eyes of some audience. In the case of bin Laden, or the case of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, it's a broad class of people in the Middle East. So the reason I endorse so strongly what Richard is trying to do is we need strategies to steal the audience. And Karen Hughes hasn't clicked into the right game plan yet, in my view. But there are some people in the administration who've been working hard on this. I also don't think it's just us. I think what is happening with the British, there's a real revolution going on in Europe, I think, that would be very important for us to learn from. But I do think it's an audience question which takes us there. But let me click in a few of these questions. There's so many hands up that I would like to kind of go around. And you have a pen? Keep track. There you go. Don't write on your brief. You can write on the back of your introduction. But yes, sir. Let me cluster some here.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. We'll get that later, please. Yes.
Yes. I think what you started with on setting up where the problems, the issue of occupation and oppression, and the fact the solution to economical empowerment, you find terrorism, it doesn't exist. I agree with you 100%. And if there's where you, with all my respect to your work and your thinking, where you failed, I think, when you came to Iraq, according to what I heard from you, I think you decided to drop that model and you went to another direction. And the failure is with some of the fact you stated, and I think it's not correct. And there is a narrative emerged after we went to Iraq. That first narrative that Iraq didn't exist is the creation of the British. The British created the borders, which has created all the set of problems. But Iraq existed for 5,000 years. So to say Iraq didn't exist, that's not correct. Number two, to divide Iraq to a simple three parts like Biden do is not the solution. Will you create completely another set of problems? Because during the Ottoman, when they decided to create these three major provinces, the reality of it was much bigger than Iraq. Like, for example, Basra was extended all the way to the Arabian Sea, where Kuwait, Bahrain, what we call the Emirates today, were part of the Basra. And when you said Mosul, Mosul was extended to large area of Syria, and it goes on. And so it was more complex than what is, well, the Ottoman have it like this and let us chop it in. The other thing is civil war in Iraq. It didn't exist prior to April of 2003. What we are seeing is a manifestation of our policies and mistakes in Iraq reflected. The reality, the whole struggle in Iraq, that inner fight, what we call a civil war or ethnic or religious, in reality it's war about power, about who want to have control of more oil and the resources of Iraq. In the vacuum we created with the dissolving of the military and no security provided in the first months in 2003 led to all that these interest groups started to try to get the power and have more control. And that's what we are seeing. It's a struggle of power. It doesn't have to do anything with, it has religious manifestation and it has an ethnic manifestation.
You need to bring it to close, but go ahead.
But what I'm saying, it is the bottom, really the reality of it. It is about economical empowerment. It reminded me, I was in Iraq in 2003. A young Iraqi was telling me, he said, neither me or my father or my grandfather, and we goes back to thousands of years, owned 1 inch of land in a country we call Iraq. And this is, I think, go back and look at Iraq from that perspective, and you're going to find your solution to it.
That's interesting. Can we cluster a couple, because this gentleman's going to leave and he's been waiting. Let me get a couple, but I'll let you jump at it right away. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to know if since your report has come out and you had much success in reaching out to your fellows business CEOs, what's been their general reaction? And if you had any rollback
Or from your business buddies.
You know, we've had, as Steve mentioned, we've had a lot of hits and a lot of downloads, and I think the reaction has been favorable. I don't think there's been any blowback, at least not that I'm aware of. I don't think anybody in the Bush administration would take me seriously one way or the other.
Well, I think.
But I'm not sure. I kind of think about what I'm doing as like one more grain of sand on the beach. Did it make any difference whatsoever?
I gave that special, but I do want him to come back to this rock thing, but since we're short on time, I want to cluster these last questions. Ann Crittenden?
I would just love to hear a little more from your perspective as someone in the economy, more about the economic consequences of what this war is doing and what all of our general reaction to terrorism is doing to ourselves.
Great.
That may help with the argument with business.
Yes, ma'am.
My question was more about going back to the structure in our government and decision making. the voice for development, for economic opportunities globally does not exist at the decision-making level, at the cabinet level. There's nobody really with that primary hat on at that table. The development assistance portfolio comes under Secretary Rice, but she also has the whole political diplomatic set of priorities. And so until you elevate that position, as they've done in the UK and in other European donor countries, it is, I think that will always get subsumed other priorities.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Our law firm represents international Islamic charities based in London and Saudi Arabia, not the Middle East, Lebanon, as a result. But if
I bet Treasury Department tracks you.
My question, it's more than that, but have either of you examined the critical role that the Treasury Department plays in the international war on terrorism? And I'll throw this out as an example. One of the charities raised $500,000, got zakat from a donor. We're going to build a hospital in Afghanistan. When the $500K was transferred to Switzerland before it could be transferred to Afghanistan, FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Network people at Treasury, sent out a harmless fax inquiring about it. The Swiss bank thought this account is going to be frozen, panics, sends the money back. The village elder told all these people the hospital's coming. He's embarrassed. The donor is upset. The charity now has a negative, is it a terrorist front and everything. And of course, who gets blamed for this? The great Satan. So I think we have underappreciated the role that the Treasury Department plays. And I can give you other instances, but I'd like to know if you know anybody who's working on that. Or
Any last comments? Shelby, did you want to ask something?
I had one question on the, I think Steve puts the question very well aimed. Are we in this business to kill terrorists or to steal the audience? These days, stealing the audience is a different thing because of the new technology. You referenced Luther earlier, and the printing press and Luther combining make great revolution. You could make a case that in an age when a short, decontextualized, horrific video can go around the world that fast, and if I have a political agenda, I can keep them coming out day and night, as well as how to build a bomb, etc. There's another level of difficulty in stealing that audience. Have you thought about that? And if you could solve it in the next 5 minutes or so, I'd be very appreciative.
So let's.
Well, let me take them quickly and in reverse order. But what you're saying is, ugly messages can get deployed instantly. So, we think, and there's corollaries in business, you can't remove the bad. You can never remove the bad from any system, whether it's a world and a population and terrorists. The way to deal with it is to increase the presence of good to offset it. So that's the way I would think about that problem. It's if you leave all that negative information out there and don't have thoughtful, counterbalancing positive information and positive acts. The charitable work that was done after the tidal wave, made us more friends for the lowest amount of money than just about anything we do. The more you have of that, the less dangerous it is to have the presence of the negative. Your comment about the economic reaction, if you just looked at the flow of funds in the world, it's not just our deficit. It's this troubling little thing called Sarbanes-Oxley out there. There's a lot of reasons that capital is aggregating in other parts of the world vis-a-vis New York in greater numbers. But one of those reasons, and you've made this comment and others have very thoughtfully, is the United States is not viewed as kind of the safe place to do business anymore to the extent it was. And that's we're ceding business to London, and we're ceding business to Hong Kong, and we're ceding business to other parts of the world. And it's dramatic. The number of initial public offerings, if you look at the entire world, if you go back about 5 years, the number of IPOs, initial public offerings, that were on an American stock exchange was about half if you go back 5 years. If you look at it today, it's about 5%. And it's not just that, it's a combination of a lot of things. Well, that's business that's going somewhere else.
But when you say the last 5 years in terms of IPO, previous 5 years, that 2000, 2002 era was an aberration. And that's what
Normalize for those things. Normalize for anything you want to do. Just look at the market share. You know, it's just go look at it. Just talk to Henry Paulson, Treasurer, because he's op-editing about it. We're losing business.
We're going to be doing a program on that, just to add, with Doug and Heidi Rediger. Doug ran, I think it was Morgan Stanley in London, but he's been writing the Wall Street Journal about this, and he'll be coming to do a program addressing this.
Your comment about restricting funding kind of, I think, fits into that whole spirit. You know, the good deeds we could be doing that could be getting us good, not only helping human lives, but getting us good PR in this, are being constrained by the very thing you mentioned.
And we reached out to Stu Levy, who heads up OFAC, and we said we wanted to have a dialogue with you. This was 4 years ago, and the Treasury Department totally rebuffed us, and we were saying we could help in the war on international terrorism. That's why I don't think a lot of American people understand the vital role the Treasury is playing in all of this. Thanks for your comments.
The very first... Pardon?
Iraq. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There was a question about the cabinet level attention to development.
Yeah,
Absence of cabinet level.
I don't disagree with what you're saying at all, but I would throw one little caveat in there. And is if you look at the foreign aid, I'm not going to be the guy that says it would just take $100 billion a year or something like that and start spending it, that we're all going to live happily ever after. Because if you look at the history of the deployment of foreign aid in the United States, most of it's been misspent. You know, somebody gets off on a tangent, and it was the Robert McNamara era. We're spending money to subsidize people's purchase of oil, and So I think the task of how you help someone is one of the most complicated tasks there is. So I would caveat what I would agree with that way. In fact, I would almost encapsulate it this way. In some respects, if we were doing nothing, it would be better than what we're doing now. And nothing doesn't cost anything. What's the doctor's axiom? First, do no harm. And if you look at American foreign policy since World War II, which we were dealing with the most complex eras and issues in history, we stopped a democratic election in Vietnam. We deposed a democratically elected leader in Iran in 1953. Blah blah blah. First, just don't get it wrong, and you'll be in a better situation. And then the task of how to do it right, I think, is the most difficult question of our age. So.
And then Iraq.
Well, Iraq, there's no question, sir, that I oversimplified when I talked about Iraq. And, I'm sure your insights are much better than mine. The question all boils down to, irrespective of what your thesis is about the past, what do you do now? And so my question to you, in appreciation of our time limitation, is, what do we do?
Yeah, by the way, the Biden answer, honestly, is not an answer, because with it...
You're telling me what not to do. I'm asking you...
Yeah, because if you go back, there was an element in the law they wrote in the transitional period, where the issue of decentralization was...
If I agree with you completely, let me just say, I agree with everything you said. I'm ready.
What
do I do?
No, the main element is you need to bring back the economical. You need to create a security for the economical growth to be created, and encourage the building of institution and separation of power. The issue of decentralization in Iraq is an important issue, but where the dangerous is to create a three segment, which is on ethnic or religious line, because that's going to lead to a disaster. And instead of what was suggested in the TAL at that time was merge 3 provinces, allow up to 3 provinces to merge together and create a new province. If you take that formula, you end up with a mixed ethnic and religious groups, and it's going to weak enough not to be able to separate, and it needs the central government, and give the local government more power on its administrative affairs, and that a way of empowering the population and not only giving the central government a power.
Which would have been possible with the Alaska Permanent Fund in Iraq.
And that's one of the, that's one of the solutions. I agree with you. I agree with you. This is, by the way, this is one of the things is being discussed and being talked about by several groups. So it is still an answer, but you cannot implement that under no security situation.
Right.
And the U.S. withdraw from Iraq is not going to bring security to Iraq. But we need to find a solution where we bring the UN, bring a much larger international force till you bring back the central government, or to bring security back again to Iraq, because terrorist groups are not going to disappear from Iraq if we withdraw tomorrow.
Yeah. Let me, did you want to add quick? Let me, basically, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. There are no silver bullets anymore. As I see it, I would like to add two quick editorial comments because I feel like they're fascinating issues that came out of our discussion among many. But on this question of development and the cabinet and raising the issue, I am every other day a fan of Condi Rice's gut instincts. I am a huge critic of her ability to win any battles in this administration. Her one seeming strength is the ability to get George Bush to every once in a while pivot in a different direction. But her ability to deploy a bureaucratic team or a team scattered through the national security bureaucracy who believes in what she believes is miserable. Her closest aides and friends admit this about her. But she is a believer in the development. So there's a problem there that's hard to fix. But I thought a little bit, I have to speak about this issue tomorrow. And I'm constantly invited to Aspen Institute and other NGO crowds approaches on how to deal with development, particularly with Africa, dealing with poverty. I've been trained by Richard Hernando de Soto, lots of other folks on how to think about this. But I'll tell you one of the things that I feel, and I'm going to be overstate for effect, I think that too many people engaged in this game in Washington pursue it as poverty remediation. I go to China and Beijing, and I look at what China is doing in Latin America. I look at what China is doing in the Middle East. I look at what China is doing in Africa. They're doing what we used to do in the 50s, what the Japanese did in Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s. They are pursuing mercantile interests in developing their own interests, their foundation, tied relationships. I just got back from Havana, Cuba. China is now the second biggest deliverer of transferred funds into Cuba, tying aid, the building of port infrastructure, which is now the Chinese are displacing the Japanese in Cuba. Now Cuba is a small market for this, but nonetheless it's fascinating. They pursue it from the business dimension. If you could take that spirit, if you could take some of the messianism that America had and apply that, and you could also take something that Europe has, which is to, Europe is like kind of a more friendly Borg in Star Trek. If you want to be part of the European Union, you adopt 80,000 rules and regulations in the acquis communautaire, and we might consider merging. And those elements, I think, address rule of law, regulation, property rights, in many ways in which you've got both carrots and incentives and disincentives. And it would be nice, when we came back to this question when I was approaching Alistair's point, to have that sort of orientation at least begin to influence some of this. On the question of Stuart Lee, because I know Stuart, and I am one of the people who sort of admire Stuart, I think that the issue with this is, as I'm very aware of OFAC, given my recent trip to Cuba, I had made sure I dotted every I and did everything correctly, is that I think that they have tripped across an incredibly effective way to strangle elites in other governments. And we haven't gotten our heads around this yet, what it means. And what it means is the kind of broad-based deployment of sanctions, which often cripple and harm or keep medical supplies or food from broad populations in terms of this, which have proved so ineffective. But boy, turn Stuart Levy on to North Korea and some banks, and the whole world goes crazy. Can't transfer $25 million because even U.S. policy, the President of the United States is saying, don't worry, we won't punish you later. It's not enough with what they've tripped across. Iran's recent flexibility behind the scenes maybe too, but we may overuse this. In fact, we may overuse the ability, and we may actually undermine it. But while I can understand the negative side effects of what you're talking about. I think it's a new, interesting way to influence elites in problematic countries without necessarily savaging an entire society abroad, and we don't have the calipers and our understanding of how to steer this yet. So you could probably enter that debate and help steer this, because it's not going to go away, more effectively. So with that, I want to thank Richard, because this is important. When we sent this out, we got some lists and we got permission from Rotary and Lions Clubs and others to send this out broadly to these Rotary. I wanted to reach these guys out there playing tennis and golf, and weren't necessarily tied onto CNN's streaming video every day or something, and to figure out how to reach them. And it is from that we reached out a lot of people and see these downloads around the country. And if we influence just a few of them to sort of think more deeply about this, and I think this has been a real win. I want to thank Richard for subjecting himself to the New America Foundation trial by fire here. But I want to thank him for his leadership, as I do think it's important for us not to just have pundits that are used to D.C. coming in here. It's good to have people who come from other sectors talk about how they see this. So I want to thank Richard Vague very much. Thank all of you for your questions.